Hi, welcome to part 3 of this Blender modeling tutorial. Today we are going to look at materials and texturing, take a look at a more complete example, and finally exporting. So far we have only been looking at grey blocks. Let's give them some color. In the outliner, if you expand the node for the default cube under data, it also has a material. If you double-click on it or go to the icon, which looks a bit like a beach ball, it will bring up the material properties. The materials in Blender are quite advanced, but most is related to rendering, which we don't worry about here. If you click on the white field next to base color, you can select a color. To see the effect, switch the viewport to material preview. If you instead click on the yellow dot, it will bring up a menu. Select Image Texture, then click Open. Then you can select pretty much any image you want to get it projected onto the surface of any object you have which uses this material. If you copy an object using Shift-D, the copy will get the same material. If you use Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V, it will get a new material. And if you create a new object, it won't get any material at all. So remember to add a material to it if you want it to have color and texture. So we have an image projected or mapped onto our object. That's great, but how do we adjust this mapping? Click on the workspace UV Editing. You will now have the UV editor to the left. If your object turned gray again, just switch the shading to viewport shading here as well. Use the scroll wheel if you don't see it. And if you don't see your texture in the UV editor, you may need to click on this image icon and select it in the list. If you for some reason don't find it in the list, you can just open it here as well. Note that when you have two editors side by side, where you have your mouse pointer will determine which one is active. Using keyboard shortcuts will do things in the editor under your cursor. The cross shape you see is the mapping of your object to the texture. If you click on a face on your object, you will see where this particular face is mapped to the texture. This is UV mapping. Each vertex in the three-dimensional space of the model is mapped onto a two-dimensional space of the texture. The letters U and V denote the axis of the texture, just as X, Y, and Z do for 3D space. In the general case, this is a difficult problem, how to project the surface of a three-dimensional object onto a flat two-dimensional surface. This is the problem map makers face. How to project the surface of a round Earth to a flat piece of paper without stretching. It turns out that this cannot be done perfectly for a sphere since it's curved in two directions, so real-world maps are all compromises. If you want less stretch, you will have to make cuts in it, like when peeling an orange. And if you don't want cuts, you will have to live with more stretching, which will get larger and larger towards the poles. So when it comes to maps, it would have been easier if the Earth actually was flat. But in Blender, things are never really round, but are built from vertices, edges and faces, so we can place cuts along edges. And some minor stretching may also be fine. For a cube, this mapping process from 3D object to 2D texture is easy. Just cut along the edges like you would do with a real box until you can flatten it out. This process is called unwrapping, the creation of the UV map for a certain object. The Blender primitives come with a default UV mapping, and for the cube they have chosen to go with this cross. When we make our own objects, we have to define this mapping ourselves. The UV editor works a bit like the 3D viewport, but for 2D. You can use many of the same shortcuts. Selecting, moving, scaling, and rotating works much the same. You can use snapping. You can press 1, 2, and 3 to select vertices, edges, and faces. You can constrain movement to an axis, but instead of X, Y, and Z, we now have U and V. But pressing X and Y works as well. Note that Y now is upwards on your texture and not Z. One important option is this drop-down up here called Sticky Selection Mode. If you turn it off, you can move faces freely, otherwise they will be connected to the rest of the mapping. You have to select the face again for the change to take effect. In Blender, these cuts to guide the unwrapping are called seams. To create one, mark one or several edges, right-click and select Mark Seam, or press U to bring up the UV mapping menu and select Mark Seam. Where to place cuts is not an exact science, but with a little experience you will develop a feel for where they make sense. It's not as hard as it may seem at first. When you think you have created enough seams for the model to be able to unfold completely, select the whole model, press U for the UV menu again, and then select Unwrap. Now go to Overlays and activate Display Stretch. If you see colors other than blue, this means these parts are stretched. Just add more cuts and unwrap again. Sometimes it makes sense to cut so you completely separate a part from the rest. Such separate parts are called islands. Note that only what you have selected will get its UV map updated. If you only select a part of your model and use Unwrap, the mapping will still cover the whole texture, so you will have to scale it down to be able to fit the rest. Okay. So when we have a UV map without any stretch, are we done? No. What we have accomplished so far is that all parts of the model have a projection onto the texture which aren't distorted, but they are still most likely not in the right places. So we have to move each part in place to match the texture. This means a lot of moving, rotating and some scaling until everything is in the right place. Try to avoid changing the scale very unevenly, since that will be noticeable on the model. Areas that are meant to use the same part of the texture should overlap. Be sure to rotate them correctly and use snapping to match them exactly. One can combine the unwrap feature with a few other techniques. One is project from view. If your model contains large flat surfaces, which often is the case for buildings, press 1 or 3 on the numpad so you are facing your model straight on, and then use project from view. A quick and easy way to unwrap the whole model without stretch is to use Smart UV Project. It can leave seams in bad places, but for lower poly game models that isn't always a big problem. If you have two objects with identical topology, and you want to copy the UV map from one to the other, first select the target, and then shift-click on the source so it's the active object, then press Ctrl L and select Copy UV Maps. Sometimes you are looking at the texture and see a mapped face and wonder which face this corresponds to in the model. Activate Sync Selection. Blender has a lot of add-ons you can activate. One is Magic UV. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Magic, and activate it. Now, if you bring up the UV menu, it has more options. Speaking of plugins, another useful one is Import Images as Planes. Activate it in the same way, and then you will have a new option in the Add menu under Image, Images as Planes. This is useful, for example, if you have a drawing of a building you are making a model of. Texturing is a large subject, and this is only a short introduction, but you should be able to get started using what I've described. The workflow I've just described assumes that you start from a texture. For example, you have created a collage of photos of a real building, or you have a texture from another model that you want to reuse. For a large model, especially the last part after unwrapping, when you match the UV to the texture, can be quite a lot of work. However, I want to mention that there is a completely different workflow. Then you instead assign different materials to different parts of your model, like one for brick, one for the roof, one for wood, and so on. Either using textures you've downloaded from a texture website or created directly in Blender using Blender's Advanced Material Editor, which I haven't talked about, and then unwrap everything, and finally use something called baking to let Blender create the final texture for you. This is perhaps a more advanced and powerful approach, but the concepts I've talked about are still relevant. The standard texture I've been talking about here, often just a plain image of the surface, is called the diffuse texture. But there are other kinds of textures. Common ones are specular, which defines reflectivity, and normal or bump map, which emulates depth in a clever way, which can make a model look much more detailed than it actually is. They can be generated using online tools. The promise of this tutorial series was that you should be able to model something like the building I showed in the very beginning of part 1 and also have in the thumbnails. So I thought we should have a closer look at that model now. I think I've talked about everything I used when I made this, so you should be able to make it as well. And of course, many other things. As you can see, I've separated things neatly into different parts and given them descriptive names. If we turn off everything except the main part here and go into edit mode, we can see that it's actually a very simple model. I've just started from a cube and then done some extrusion and subdivided it and some scaling and so on. So there are some minor details, but it's not much. As you can see, there are very few trees and edges and faces and vertices. It's just 70 vertices. So it's a very simple model actually. And then I have removed the front part, as you can see. If we then go into object mode, you can see that all these windows and doors and stuff appear. So how is that? Well, if we go to the modifiers here under the wrench, you see I have a whole stack of them here. And they are all booleans with a difference. settings. And there is one for each of these. You see up here, they are called, I've named them stamps. And if I turn off the main part again, you see these are just simple blocks that I've textured with windows and doors. And as I showed in part 2, the Boolean modifier with the difference settings can be useful to make holes in a mesh. So all these are of course applied to the main building. And if finally I'm not going to save these stamps. They are not part of the final model. They are just to make these cuts or holes. And one advantage with this is that I can easily move them around. So for example, if I turn this on and grab it and just, I don't know, move it a little bit and then turn it off again, then you see the hole has actually moved. So it's very flexible. I can shift them around and move them around very easily, and that will transfer to the final model. And then of course some of these stamps that I've called them have modifiers themselves, like for example the windows in the back. They have array modifiers, one in, should be called X here perhaps. So you can see this one goes in X direction and this one goes in the Z direction. So again, it's very flexible. I can you can adjust the number of floors and so on. And if we go back to the front and turn on this is not using booleans, since the front windows, they are not a simple sort of hole or dent in the main model, because they actually have a frame, so it would be hard to do this with just a boolean. So this is just a separate part of the model, and it's also using arrays, of course, because everything is identical here. So this is it's actually just one window that I've modeled. Start with a plane and just inset and extrude, inset again and extrude and move it back. So it's just like this. So, and then again, it's very flexible with this array, so I can adjust the number of floors. Okay, then there are just a few details left. I have some chimneys. They are very simple and identical. So again, it's just a box, and I extrude it, scaled a bit, extrude it again, inset and extrude, move downwards, done, and copied. Okay, and then I have some dormers. Also very simple. They are identical, and they actually should also have a modifier like an array and then mirror, but for some reason I've already applied them, or maybe I was lazy and just copied it, moved it like 4 meters or whatever it is, and then rotated it. But it's also very simple little model. Is again just a cube. I've modified it and some subdivision and inset and extrude. And if I press 3 on the numpad to have a look from the side, I've just made sure that it matches the roof. It doesn't have to be exact, which it isn't, but pretty close. So it's just manual moving it. Okay, and then I have some downspouts or drain pipes. And that is, again, a very simple object. It's just a cylinder. So I started with a cylinder. Make sure you have X-ray on and press 2 to have edge select. And then you can alt-click to sort of grab the whole circle. And then you can extrude and press Z. So you have constraint to this direction. And then you can extrude again and scale, and if you press scale, Z and 0, so it's flat. So it's this kind of operations, and I've done it up here as well. So, and then they are not identical because this one on the back is straight and this one has a little angle here. But I've just copied them. Okay, and finally then I have some decorations that are called anchor plates, and they are common on this kind of old building. So we go take the front here, for example. And these are of course also arrays in X and Z direction. And it's extremely simple. It's just one plane. And it hovers, if you look from the side, you can see it's like 1 centimeter in front of the wall. I don't know if this is a common solution, but it works very well. They disappear in Blender, but in game it works very well. So we can have a look at the texture. I made this, so it's a collage. And actually if I turn everything on and select everything, you see this building isn't using the entire texture. And that is normally a bad thing because you want to utilize all the texture space you have. My defense here is that I reuse this texture for many different buildings that are perhaps similar but not identical. So I actually end up saving a lot of memory. So that's my defense for not using the whole texture. I can show them as well. I have them here under export. They are all similar and they use the same texture. So making the first one took the longest, and then because of what I've shown, I've used a lot of these stamps and arrays. It's easy to modify the number of floors and so on. So yeah, this is actually very odd building, but they exist. Yeah, so, but they look slightly different, many of them. And here are corners. Yeah, some work, of course, to get a corner instead, but same principle. And these last two you may even recognize if you've been to Stockholm. They are at Stora Torget in Gamla Stan. This one is red, but I can change the color in game. And this one is actually orange or yellow. And finally, down here I have the Lod model. I've deleted all the others, so I just saved it for the original building I showed in the beginning. But this is a simplified version, very low poly. It's 164 trees. So now no modifiers, no arrays, everything is merged into one object. The windows are now just planes, and they are a little bit in front of the building, so it should look very similar to the original one from a larger distance. So I think that was pretty much it. There are a number of steps that you may need to do before exporting to make sure your model will look as planned. Here are some things to keep in mind. When making assets for a game, it's important to keep your trees count down, since it affects performance. This is perhaps less critical than it used to be, since computers have gotten so much faster, but everything in a scene or in a game adds up, so it still matters. You want the best possible model you can get with as few triangles as possible. This means deleting things that never will be seen in the game, like insides, undersides, and so on. It's also easy to miss unnecessary faces created using, for example, the extrude tool. New materials are created when you copy objects. If they are all using the same texture, you can and should get rid of them. Go to Object Mode, select all objects except your original one with the original material. Then shift-click on the original object to make it the active object. Press Ctrl L and choose Link Materials. If you save and restart Blender and open your file again, Blender will have removed the unused materials. Join everything to one object before exporting, but make a copy of the whole object collection first, and merge the copy. In Edit mode, select everything, hit M and then select Merge by Distance. This should get rid of duplicated geometry. You can use the function Mesh, Clean Up, Delete Loose to remove any loose geometry, but check so nothing you want to keep disappears. Hit Ctrl A and select Apply all transforms. Go to Overlays and activate Face Orientation, and make sure that you don't see any red faces or have any unintended holes in your model. If your model has a normal map, it can matter if faces are UV mapped upside down or reversed. It will make the normal map to not behave as intended. The effect may be subtle, but if you really want a top-notch model, you should check this. It can be hard to see with your current texture. Just Google UV Texture Guide, download an image you like, and open that texture instead. Now it should be easy to see if anything is flipped. Take a final close look at your model. Does it look as you intended, or have you forgotten anything? It saves time to do this now instead of realizing something is wrong or missing when you have imported it in the game. Is everything textured correctly? Stretching can sometimes be more visible in the game than in Blender. You can add some lights to see better and switch to rendered view. The software you are exporting to may have different coordinate conventions. For example, City Skylines has Y as up. This means you should rotate the origin 90 degrees around X. Fix this by clicking on Active Tool and Workspace Settings and check Affect Only Origins. An axis gizmo appears at the world origin. Rotate as usual by pressing R followed by X and type in 90. The origin will be rotated instead of your model. Remember to uncheck the option again when you are done. If you apply all transforms, the orientation will be back to normal. Finally, it's time to export your model. With your object selected, go to File, Export, and select the file format. I use FBX. If you right-click on the menu option, you can add a shortcut. I've added Ctrl-Alt-C for FBX export. In the export dialog, tick Limit to selected objects, and you should only export the mesh. Type in a file name and hit export. So, when you finally think you are done, There is one more thing that you may or may not need to do, and that is a Lod model. Lod stands for level of detail. Many games replace the full model with a simpler one when it's far away, as an optimization. So the Lod model is just a very low poly version of your full model that should look very similar at a distance. It probably also should have a very low resolution texture. Okay, I have now covered everything I wanted to cover in this pretty condensed introduction to modeling in Blender. To sum up, there are quite a lot of things to learn and remember, as you may have noticed. You will probably get stuck or confused from time to time. I certainly have. But almost always others have had the same problem, and you will be able to find a solution online. You can also check the Blender manual, which can be a good reference. I've included the link in the description. Blender may take some time to get productive in, but just keep going and you will get stuck less and less. I wish you the best of luck with your modeling, and thank you for watching.